Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending where you're joining us. Welcome to Post Talk Live. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News and your host. It is Tuesday, August 12th, and today we are going to be talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s decision to cut nearly 24 mRNA vaccine contracts with BARDA and to halt further work on the technology platform. Kennedy has said that the vaccines don't perform well, and his claim they actually might drive transmission of respiratory illnesses rather than stifle it. Now, that runs contrary to one of President Donald Trump's signature achievements from his first term, which is spearheading the rapid development of the vaccines to combat COVID-19 under Operation Warp Speed. One of the leaders of HHS at that time, Admiral Brett Giroir, joins us today. Giroir led the US's COVID-19 testing effort, oversaw public health policy, and previously worked in biodefense and science at the Pentagon. He's worked in academics. He's been I believe, director of the FDA as well, commissioner of the FDA as well, in addition to a number of roles. We'll also be joined by Max Bayer, our pharma reporter who covers the intersection of the biopharma industry and Washington politics and policy. He's tightly sourced on MAHA and the Kennedy administration at HHS. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, hello. Post Talk Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom. We bring it live to you. And if you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, please go ahead and hit the little subscribe button below our feed to get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Talk email on your Endpoints News subscription page. Now, for those of you who are with us on YouTube today, you can also join the live chat and the conversation. Our producer will send those over to me, and I can pass questions along to our group. And if you miss us live, recordings are going to live on YouTube and Spotify, as well as Apple Podcasts. So welcome, Max. Welcome, Admiral Giroir. Let's get started. Admiral, I want to ask you, I mean, you have done a ton in government. Back when I was in another role, I covered you all the time during the COVID pandemic. You're in the private sector now. Will you just walk us through what you are doing now, how that transition into the private sector has been, kind of your post-government life, to the extent that it is fully post-government? Because I know you also did some advising during the transition and things like that. What are you up to these days?
Well, thanks for having me on. I took a little time after leaving DC. President Biden's administration asked me to stay for a few weeks, even though I wasn't formally there. And of course, I was honored to do that to help even further in the transition. I didn't expect to write a book, but my wife said, you've really got to write all this stuff down because it's important for history, for people to understand what was happening behind the scenes and how a few people made such a big difference. So I spent some time doing that. And then I was notified or heard of an opportunity that really fit sort of my whole mantra, and that is a small new start biotech company that was founded out of Emory called Altessa Biosciences. And the reason it appealed to me when it was just getting started and just in the seed round was it was focusing on antiviral drugs because I've always been very interested in and profoundly dedicated to anti-infectives. I'm a pediatric ICU doctor by training and have really focused on infectious diseases. But secondly, I sort of metaphorically signed $6 billion of checks for testing during the COVID pandemic. And really, there were some amazing technologies developed. There were some incredible paradigms of test to treat and telemedicine. And I thought, why waste all this money just on the pandemic? How could we use this investment and these paradigm changes to improve the lives of people in this country and around the world? So Altessa Biosciences has a direct acting drug against rhinovirus, the most common virus on the planet. And we're focusing on people with chronic lung disease, mostly COPD, and in the future asthma, for whom rhinovirus is just not a cold, but it really is a life-threatening event. So this kind of fit what I was doing. And as you said, you never really get out of government. I try to help when I can. I did work during some of the transition at the request of the acting secretary, and am so pleased to be here with you today.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having us. I want to turn things over to Max, who's been following this story really closely in a second, but just to kind of tee that up, what was your reaction when you saw the news on the changes to some of these BARDA contracts on mRNA? I'd be and I want to hear it. I think both from you as someone who now works in biotech, but obviously someone who also spent a huge amount of time on kind of on biopreparedness as well. What was your reaction when you heard that news?
Well, I have to say I wasn't surprised because with the rhetoric that was preceding it and the previous cancellation of the Moderna contract, you kind of expected something like this to happen, although you didn't want it to happen. Really, mRNA technology dates back to my old days at DARPA when I ran the science office at
Yeah.
DARPA, where we thought it would be an interesting and novel platform for a variety of reasons. But I was very concerned with the cancellation of the contracts because for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think the data about mRNA vaccines were mischaracterized. These are not dangerous vaccines. These are life-saving vaccines. They are very effective in what they're intended to do, and that is, like other respiratory vaccines, not necessarily prevent you from getting the virus, but preventing the morbid or fatal consequences of having that virus. So it's very effective in that way, just the same way influenza and the RSV vaccines may not protect you against getting the virus, but it protects from the consequences. So I thought the whole premise was wrong. I mean, the facts that were stated were not facts at all. They're not scientifically justified. They're actually against the data. What really concerned me as well is that, and I did an assessment during the transition of this about mRNA vaccines and their role, particularly for avian influenza. But mRNA vaccines are unique in that they can be rapidly developed and reliably manufactured. And that's the reason why during COVID, the mRNA vaccines were the first out and the most effective. And mRNA vaccines, in my assessment, and I have high confidence in this assessment, are our best protection against a novel pandemic threat. It's our best protection against a novel avian influenza, and certainly required if we're concerned about bioweapons and intentional attacks.
Admiral, just what was your experience sort of monitoring the development of these vaccines during Operation Warp Speed? Because I think something that I've sort of noticed is how concern with them has been maybe swept up over the years since, but there was concern from a growing cohort of voices almost immediately within the first 6 months of their rollout in 2021. What can you sort of speak to about those phase 3 trials before they were originally approved, and the data that you were briefed on at the time about their safety?
Yeah, now we fully understood that there had not been a previous mRNA vaccine that was brought into widespread use. So this was, quote, a new technology. Now it was built on 20 years of work, but it was really this was its first use in its intended way. So we were obviously cognizant of that. One of our major goals was to make sure that we had adequate enrollment in the trials, and the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, was really spectacular in this. One of our concerns was to make sure that we had underrepresented minorities included in the trials very early, because once we read out the trial results, we didn't want to have like 1% African Americans, and we couldn't assure that African Americans, were safe, or women, or underserved populations. So we had a lot of focus on making sure the trials were conducted, correctly, right, and representative, and done in a highly scientific fashion. What was always in my mind, though, is, and I think it got diluted, particularly after the Trump administration, is that we always thought of focusing the vaccines on those that are most in need. And I think this probably got a little bit off track, where a 14-year-old needed to get all the vaccines the same way as a 75-year-old in a nursing home. And of course, a 14-year-old, particularly, or an 18-year-old young man, is at much higher risk of complications and at very low risk of actual disease. So I think in the context, it was spectacularly successful in sort of a pre-immune population or an at-risk population to reduce hospitalizations and severe consequences. And so, we were very cognizant of the safety issues, but, we had, I went to bed every night knowing that 2,000 or 3,000 Americans were going to die the next day of COVID. And what could I do more? What's one other thing, one other show I can do to help educate the people, one other test I could bring, one other contribution? So if you remember how awful it was, and what an incredibly trying situation, the opportunity to provide a vaccine that protected against hospitalizations and deaths was it wasn't a miracle. Miracles happen after hard work and 20 years of research, but it was something we were very proud of, and I think the president is still proud of that achievement, which I think is one of the most marked achievements in medicine in recent memory.
I want to ask you, I mean, because you have a unique perspective on this, just like when we think about, there's obviously this enormous debate going on right now about, how much should government spend, whether we're talking about grants to universities, whether we're talking about what the NIH is doing. But when you think, I mean, I guess maybe specifically about, the role in biopreparedness and some of these grant making authorities and things like that, how do you, I think from a kind of a more like, how do you step back and say, all right, where should government be involved in here? And what is the purpose of government when it comes to, saying, all right, we need to step in and either support this company or support this technology, just how you're thinking about, we need to place a whole lot of bets or just a few bets. Can you just kind of, just talk to our audience a little bit about, I think from a strategic standpoint, what the role and function is outside the context of, a full-on pandemic happening right in that moment? Because it's, I think, very obvious to people in the OWS capacity, but maybe now we're not in the middle of a pandemic, so like talk to us through that and where you see the role.
So I have a very DARPA-centric view of this, and I worked with DARPA 6 or 7 years before I actually went there, as many people do. And one key role of government funding is to take some really big bets that are too high risk for the private sector that can pay off enormously for national security or public health. And that's a traditional DARPA role that's been done in the military. When I was there, obviously for biodefense, we did a lot of work, the brain control bionic arm that responded to amputees. And I think it's been the whole mantra of ARPA-H is to take those risks that venture capital would never take and that the NIH would never take, because the NIH is a very conservative organization. So I think that's a clear role for government funding. Going to the BARDA side, there clearly is, there are some technologies that by definition are not going to be in the marketplace, right? An anthrax vaccine is not going to have a commercial market. So there clearly is a role, if there's a need, a requirement of the government, that those need to be funded and sort of taken off the table. We hope we never use a smallpox vaccine or smallpox antivirals, but we absolutely need them. And I think the third category is really for essential technologies that we're going to need as platforms. And let's talk about testing a little bit that I knew a lot about. I think part of the problem with COVID is we never thought testing was going to be important because we were preparing for an avian influenza outbreak, and when you have the flu.
Right.
And if you're asymptomatic, you don't have the flu and you're not going to transmit it. We were hit with a virus where 50% of the transmission was asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, and you can have a variety of symptoms from a cold to death. And so testing was very important, but there was no focus on that. Literally the day I took over, there wasn't even a mailing list on who to call, phone numbers, who makes the technology, who makes a swab, who makes VTM, where are the tests coming from, any national strategy. And I think that was an oversight due to focusing on things that didn't require testing. So I think government funding of platforms that could clearly be used during the next pandemic is an important role. But that's sort of general. I don't think the government needs to fund every private sector enterprise through a phase 3 trial. But high risk technologies or therapeutics that have no use in the real world, commercial world, and those essential platforms. And I think there's some in testing that we really have to have so that the next testing czar doesn't have to, start looking on Google and calling people on Amazon and figuring out, phone lists. Those technologies need to be there and ready to go so that we could have 100 million tests in 2 weeks, not in 3 months.
I want to sort of hit on something that you mentioned, which was just sort of maybe how ultimately the inoculation strategy with these vaccines maybe sort of sowed more distrust in the actual technology. And so I sort of want to widen that to how maybe people's aversion or the polarization of some of the other public health policies, be it masking or social distancing or vaccine mandates, sort of fed into concern and fear about mRNA technology broadly. Is that something that you've sort of sensed in the years since 2020? Is that this is being grouped into people's larger frustration with that pandemic policy?
Yeah, I think you're 100% exactly right. Is that sort of there's a building upon frustrations and a building upon of some fear and doubt. And I've said it several times, is that public health officials, many of them really didn't approach the pandemic with a lot of humility. There was sort of a black and white answer, even when it wasn't black and white. And trust is a very easy thing to lose, and it's hard to re-earn that. So when there's such flip-flops with such certainty, I'm a pediatric ICU doctor. Fundamentally, I've never had a parent be upset with me if I said, I don't know what's going on with your child, but I'm going to do everything possible, and this is what we're going to do in order to get there. I would never say, I know everything that's going on and your child's going to be fine, when I don't know that. And I think we need to approach public health with humility, and that soured a lot of people, and sort of we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And of course, when you have someone who is right on so many things, like RFK Jr. is, he's right on MAHA, he's right on nutrition, he's right on environmental toxins, but I think he's absolutely wrong on mRNA. But when a person who has that kind of charisma and sort of track record of being right on a lot of things starts saying bad things about mRNA vaccines, that's going to influence a lot of people to believe that they really are dangerous when they're not, and they really are not effective when they really are very effective. And there's a very important use for them as a rapid response tool to any pandemic. And look, I'm an all of the above guy, right? There's not one thing that's a silver bullet. We need to have public health measures. We need to have hospital preparedness. We need to make sure our testing infrastructure is great. We shouldn't be doing things like canceling the AVID NIH program to develop antivirals that are not only for pandemics, but could have very broad use. We forget about that. I think that's a very important pillar in this, because Paxlovid was very important, molnupiravir is very important, Tamiflu is very important, and then we have the whole vaccine strategy. So I think we have several strikes against us: canceling the antivirals, really letting a lot of the testing infrastructure go bankrupt because of a lack of government support. Now the vaccine infrastructure is really being troubled, and honestly, I don't know who's in charge. I was very disheartened to see Jerry Parker leave the White House, who's an extremely competent, serious, non-political leader for pandemic preparedness. So I'm not really sure who's calling the shots right now, but all the shots that I'm seeing are kind of going in the wrong direction.
You mentioned this the trust idea, and the government infrastructure that's kind of being either neglected or purposefully dismantled. And I wanted to bring that back to something I think you mentioned very early on, which was in the development of these vaccines. There was a lot of thought to, like, how do we make sure we represent the right minority groups, especially in populations where we know there's hesitancy, so that when it comes time to have that conversation, we can say we have the data on it. And it feels like we have in some ways, a very old type of vaccine hesitancy, but in other ways, I think kind of exploding in a very new way. Do you have thoughts when we think about what is going to need to either be built or rebuilt, after this moment, assuming we have the capacity to do that? Both how much damage has been done right now, and then also how you start getting back to a better place with some of these people who have lost trust. Do you see a path back to this stuff?
It's a very difficult pathway back. And I say that from a healthcare provider perspective. Way back 5 careers ago as a chief medical officer of a pediatric health system. So I've dealt with all kind of hesitancies against the medical care system, but also as a public health person, it's very difficult to regain trust. I think some of the things that the administration is emphasizing is really important, like to make sure we have transparency, right? That everybody can understand the data, to make sure that we don't have conflicts of interest, because all these things are very, very important to sort of lay the foundation for regaining trust.
Yeah.
So I
Can I
salute.
interrupt you though? Because I
Yeah,
mean, do you
please.
I guess like when I see some of the COI stuff and Max has reported on this, like we talk about, don't have conflicts of interest, but then some of these
Yeah.
people look just as conflicted or, kind of biased in their takes, I think, as they would claim a lot of the people they're replacing. It's like, I feel like I agree with the headline a lot of times. I'm like, that sounds great. But then, gold standard science, but then you kind of don't see it in the execution.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think almost everybody has some type of conflict of interest
Right.
or bias based on where they've been, and I agree. Some of the appointees, particularly on ACIP, I think carry in views that are not really scientific, and whereas some people who have a conflict of interest, I mean, if you're important in a field in biology or in medicine, there's a likelihood that you will have taken some type of industry funding somewhere, right? If you're doing a large clinical trial, that could be 3, 4, $500 million. Those are
Right.
sponsored by industry. That doesn't mean you're a stooge for industry. So I agree with you that there's lots of shades of gray here, but in general, assuring people that there are no conflicts of interest or the conflicts are managed, and that people come with an open mind is an important start, right?
Yeah.
It's a start. But I do get concerned where um, I'm sort of a process guy. I mean, I don't want to be paralyzed by the process. But when you have really good government officials that don't have conflicts, that make a decision after open transparency and they're overruled by a political appointee, it looks great if that political appointee is on your side and you agree with him or her. But when you're not, you would
Yeah.
be screaming to the rafters. And we've had a lot of that lately, which is very concerning because I do believe we need to have advisory committees. They shouldn't be dismantled. We need to have transparency. People need to listen. When I was acting FDA commissioner, um, I was only that way for a couple of months, but I told the people I will never put my hands on the scales, but I will put my boot in your butt because I want you to make decisions as quickly as possible because people's lives depend on it. But I was very careful in giving them whiskey and fresh horses, not putting my hands on the scale, but really making sure that they understood that lives were in danger. We needed to do things quickly, and it worked out pretty well. And I think it worked out pretty well for testing too when I was in charge of testing for CDC and FDA. Really, so that's what I'm trying to contrast here. You need leadership, but the leadership can't unilaterally make decisions. I think that's antitrust, not trust building.
It does feel like we have that right now, and I'm curious how you would assess this. You mentioned sort of loosely referencing like who is in charge, and frankly, I think we in the newsroom have sort of asked ourselves a similar question, and we reported on a little bit of the aftermath of this BARDA decision and how it caused a bit of a rift at the top leadership positions of HHS about the comms rollout. And it wasn't the first time that we've seen criticism of this new health administration, whether it was leaks coming out of the White House or other places about concern with the messaging, concern with the amount of data that's being accompanied by some of the major decisions. I wonder, when you were there briefly at the beginning of this year, what was your message to them, or what were you sensing already then about how they were going to be handling some of the most contentious issues, and what your advice was to them to deal with that and to mitigate outcry?
So I was there just for a short period of time, and I was primarily asked to work on avian influenza,
Uh,
to understand what the status of the outbreak is, what is the status of our approaches, what is the information. Spent a lot of time at the CDC with the new director, who I'm very impressed with. Susan Monterez, I didn't know her beforehand. I spent many hours with her. I think she's data driven. She's not political. I think she's a very solid person. And also working a little bit on the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, because I did have a lot of international experience. So I was really focused on those content issues because there was just all kind of information coming in that were diametrically opposed. So I really worked on that primarily. And that is one reason that I feel so concerned about dropping mRNA technology or causing distrust in mRNA technology, because I still believe for an unknown biothreat or even a hot new avian influenza strain that has, major mutations in the major antigens, that we're going to have to rely, or we're likely going to have to rely on an mRNA vaccine to get us, started out of the pandemic. So, my work at the beginning of the year kind of reaffirmed that
Yeah.
this was still the best approach, that we have a few million in the stockpile. That's only a few million. You got to give them twice, so they're not highly immunogenic. They're likely not going to be effective against a new hot mutated strain. And, we can't start egg-based production for, 300 million doses of vaccines with a bird flu that kills, fertilized embryos of eggs. So again, that's what I was primarily working on, content issues. The secretary wasn't there. His own people weren't there. They had some beachhead people, but that's what I was doing. And that was a good role for me. And I was happy to do that, but didn't want to have a long-term commitment to the government.
One quick follow-up on sort of this messaging, and I think this is something that I've raised with people is in some corners of HHS, whether it's the BARDA announcement, whether it's sort of what we were seeing reported about mRNA in NIH grant requests, is concerned that you have one wing that's saying that these are not safe or effective or both products, and then simultaneously you have the FDA that's continuing to approve them, admittedly sort of in a smaller population than previously, but you still have the FDA essentially co-signing their risk benefit in a large population of Americans. How does that help or not help Americans try and parse through whether this is safe or not, and this maybe constant usurping of FDA guidance on products, particularly mRNA?
Yeah, well, it doesn't help, right? When the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or they're actually doing opposite things. I haven't worked a lot with Dr. McCary, but I did work with him before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and I think he's a solid guy, right? Very solid guy. Certainly, he's got his opinions, but is science-based. And I think the continued approval of vaccines, particularly mRNA vaccines, is all you need to hear. The FDA has a robust process. They have serious people. They're led by an excellent commissioner. And, I would be confused as hell if I heard the secretary saying these are dangerous vaccines and they don't work, and the FDA saying, yes, we're going to limit them a little bit because we have to look at the side effect profile, which I am 100% supportive of, right? We have to target the vaccines where the risk is high of the natural disease and the side effects are low. That's your major risk benefit. So it would be very confusing. I just think of, again, I put myself in a pediatric ICU role. I think of the mom out there, the dad out there, that's just trying to make simple decisions about what's best for their family. And I think the communications have been unintelligible to most average families who are just trying to do the right thing. We shouldn't dumb down our messages to the American public. I think that is a fault of a lot of people during the pandemic. They could handle some complexity, they could handle some doubt, but they can't handle diametrically opposed statements. And in my opinion, some of them that are baseless without fact or data to support them. And look, I think Secretary Kennedy has had tremendous positive influence on a number of things like nutrition and environmental toxin. Fluoridation is a real issue. This is not a fringe issue. It's a real scientific issue. But on the issue of vaccines, I think he's driving the country in the wrong direction. We're taking investments out of things that we need to invest in. And I think creating an air of vaccine hesitancy and fear that is going to result in, outbreaks of diseases that should be in history books, not in our hospitals.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I mean, how do you, I think something that a question that I have, as someone who covered the pandemic, and is editing a newsroom full of smart people covering this era, like I have a really hard time kind of bridging logically, like all the enthusiasm and success of what happened in Trump 1.0 with this technology and where we are now. Because like the guy in the White House hasn't changed in any, like how do you, I mean, can you, I mean,
I,
can you bridge those things, or is it just
I,
a
I,
logical
I can't,
impossibility?
I can't bridge it because
Yeah.
the President Trump I knew was very supportive of the public health agenda in general. The opioid epidemic was declared a public health emergency,
Yeah.
right? It was not looked at. Jerome Adams and I led needle exchange programs, naloxone programs, medication assisted treatment. I pitched to the president ending HIV in the United States. He loved it and he announced it at the State of the Union. In September of 2019, he signed an executive order for improving a pandemic influenza vaccines. He allowed me to regulate kid-flavored cigarettes, e-cigarettes, and then, of course, Operation Warp Speed. So I really saw Trump. We all have our little headlines where things went wrong, but in general, he was extraordinarily supportive of the public health agenda. And I'm seeing policies that are not of the president I knew. mRNA vaccines and Operation Warp Speed can be one of his lasting legacies, and that's really being shot down primarily by the secretary. We saw movements to stop the HIV funding, which again is one of his tremendous legacies. Remember, that program resulted in a 20% decrease in HIV in jurisdictions over the past few years. What a legacy. So I can't square the circle here. This is not the President Trump policies I know. And President Trump doesn't change very much, right? He is who he is.
Yeah.
He is what you see. So I think this has got to be driven from other people in the administration or the secretary, OMB, but not the president, because it's not the president I knew.
I want to sort of bring this home here and you tie it to sort of your current work. How has this shifting guidance or sort of we're going to back this, but not this, we're not anti-vaccine, we're looking at this vaccine, but not mRNA, recognizing that you're working in antivirals, you are still targeting rhinovirus. How have you had to deal with investors, deal with your board, deal with the development of your program? Has that been a little topsy-turvy for you? And just maybe like how you've had to shift around from someone with this government expertise, knowing how these things maybe should run or have run in the past, with trying to lead a biotech in a sector that, this isn't what this call is about, but it's been struggling, particularly infectious diseases.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I have a great board, and you might recognize one member of our board, Moncef Slaoui, who ran Operation Warp Speed and GSK vaccines beforehand, so it's extremely experienced. But it has been very confusing to the venture community and to the strategics because there's so many unknowns, right? There's so many unknowns whether, what policies are going to be supported, how reimbursement could be affected. And I think it's driven people to look at more late stage opportunities than early stage opportunities. And for some people, if it has an infectious disease bent to it, even though we're really a pulmonary focused company, we're focusing on respiratory illnesses. For a lot of people, if there's ID anywhere in there, a virus or a bacteria, they don't want to touch it, right? Because there's just too many unknowns out there in the community. So, it hasn't killed innovation or killed interest, but I think the uncertainty has made people move towards other areas. And you see that AI, other technologies, as opposed to sort of traditional sort of healthcare investments. And it certainly shifted things to be later on in the process. And like anything, some investors are really frightened and uncertain and don't want to go there. And, there are a few who say, damn the torpedoes, because humans have struggled with viruses since before the onset of Homo sapiens, and we do need an all of the above strategy. They're not going away. And again, when I say all of the above, you need public health measures and you need teaching. You also need testing, you need vaccines, and you need antivirals or antibacterials. And many people do realize that. And again, our focus, Altessa's focus is to take some of the lessons of the pandemic and some of the good things that came out of it, and some of the good things we did, like, testing in pharmacies, testing at home, the understanding of test to treat, telemedicine, telehealth, and bring that, there are 18 million people with COPD in our country that once they start having exacerbations, they have a mortality rate of 50% within 5 years. I mean, that's worse than most cancers. And rhinovirus is the number one cause of exacerbations, but there's no antiviral to treat that. So very unlike COVID or flu or other viral diseases. So we're trying to learn the lessons from the COVID pandemic, bring antivirals into a paradigm that's well tested now, right? You can't watch the news or a Super Bowl without hearing, if it's COVID, think Paxlovid, right? People understand that antivirals do work. And certainly we've seen near miracles with HIV antivirals, right? That make HIV a completely survivable disease. We can cure hepatitis C virus. So now is the time to start knocking off these other respiratory viruses. You know, we need better drugs for flu. We certainly need antivirals for RSV, rhinovirus, you know, human metapneumovirus, all these things that we can now test for and specifically treat or develop treatments. You know, I think it's a great opportunity to improve health, particularly those who are chronically ill. And, you know, that's what I'm trying to do. And, you know, I like small teams. You know, ICU teams are great. DARPA is all about small teams. So, you know, we're $40 million into investment, raising another round. We still have 11 people. And they're really good people, including the former CMO of GSK, Kate Nobile, who joined us because of the strength of the paradigm. So, you know, we're going to rock on. We think this is the right way. We could help a lot of people, starting with COPD. And then as an intensivist for children, whenever rhinovirus came around, all the children with asthma were in the emergency room in the ICU. And I'd like to prevent that and have all these people have a better quality of life and not fear going in public because they were, you know, devastated by respiratory infections.
Well, I was very worried a minute or two ago that we were going to have to end this on a real downer note. So it's I appreciate a little bit of optimism as we wrap up the show. Admiral Giroir, you know, thank you for everything you've done in your service in government. Appreciate it. Appreciate having you here with us. Thank you so much, Max, for joining us and helping lead this conversation. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you to our audience for being with us. We are going to be following all of these topics closely as always, and you can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news or by subscribing to our newsletters. The recording of this conversation will live on YouTube, and the audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you are already signed up for our Post Talk newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news, and then in the top right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link, then preferences, and then click to activate Post Talk. I promise there's an easier way of doing that coming soon. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. We hope to see you at our live events, including our Endpoints 11 Awards Gala coming up this fall in Boston. Early bird tickets are available on our website. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. This is Post Talk Live. I'm Drew Armstrong. We will see you the next time news breaks.